Scripture this morning comes from the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 11. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, "My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best. But God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. And so just for a few minutes this morning, I want to draw some lines around verse 1, which reads, "Therefore, since we have been surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses." I want to begin this morning by suggesting to you that everything that you and I have is directly tied to those who have gone before us. Their pain and struggle has paved the way for us, just as our pain and our struggle is paving the way for those who are coming behind us. And so in this sense, my brothers and sisters, I believe, and hopefully you will agree with me, that it takes a village. It takes a village to make it. That the walk of faith was never intended to be a solo journey or an individual endeavor. That our help, our strength, our encouragement is found in communities of faith. The communities of faith that we are not just around, but that we belong to. Communities of faith that we commit to. That our success is not the byproduct of individuality or our individuality, our personal resources, personal creativity, or anything else that promotes individualism over being connected to Christ in a faithful community. So that's the entire sermon. I could sit down right now. That's the whole sermon, right? But if you give me just 2 more minutes, I want to suggest to you that Hebrews 12, the book of Hebrews 12, a very familiar passage to most of us, is actually the conclusion that the biblical writer of the book of Hebrews has drawn based upon the writer's reflection, if you will, of the stories that were presented in Hebrews chapter 11. In fact, Hebrews chapter 11 concludes with these words: "These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect." Now, I need to just pause right here, and maybe you can help me to answer this question, because as I reflected on that, the question that came to my mind, Brother Pastor, was, what level of faith does a person have to believe God and never see or experience what God has promised? Y'all need to go back and read Hebrews chapter 11. I mean, how do you quantify walking and living by faith in a God that you cannot see, often struggling to hear, and then on top of all of that, facing unbelievable pain and suffering, yet you continue praying, you continue believing, and hoping for better, or at the very least that things will get better, and then they don't. Oh yeah, and for those of us that are old enough, their final words to us was, "I'm going home to be with the Lord." What kind of faith? What kind of person could exhibit that level of faith? But yet, according to the biblical writer of Hebrews, that was the testimony of those listed in Hebrews 11. And dare I say, that was, or it was, the testimony of some of our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and I could go on. And so that brings us this morning to the power of stories and narratives. No, Dr. Emmanuel didn't see the connection. That it is through stories, church, and narratives that you and I are able to find our connection with our families of birth. We are able to discover and to understand our familial identity, connect with our culture, and gain a deeper and more meaningful knowledge of our history. In essence, the stories that some of us grew up on, listening to, again, those old folks, they were the seeds that God birthed in us to help us come to understand who we are, where we come from, and how they persevered. That stories are essential because stories illuminate the road that those who have gone before us have traveled. Stories illuminate how our own paths have been paved by the struggles our ancestors and parents faced, by the blood that they have shed, by the sacrifices that they have made. And you and I are able to sit here today and declare by God's grace, we are beneficiaries. Story remind us that someone else's pain paved your way. Someone else's suffering opened the door for the success that you and I are enjoying today. Hebrews 11 and 12 are a reminder to God's people that we are because someone else was. And if you want to make it personal, I am because of what someone else did. Or it takes a village. That contrary to popular opinion and the talking heads, there are no solo actors, no individual heroes and sheroes. Because if it had not been for those who have gone before us, I declare you and I would not be where we are today. There is an African proverb, and those of you that are history students of African history, I hope I get this right. But there is an African proverb that comes out of Ghana that goes something like this: go back and fetch what you have lost. And it is out of this proverb that the concept of something called Sankofa emerges. Right? The retracing of a person's steps, the recalling of your history, reflecting on the journey of the ancestors and those who have gone before us. But don't just look back, you got to learn something from it. And so, from a practical standpoint, looking back can give you a greater appreciation for where you are. How many people know that sometimes you cannot see your progress by looking at where you are? But you can appreciate your progress by reflecting on how far you've come. Or how far we've come. That sometimes you got to look back, church. Because, you know, we get so messed up with the now that we forget we're not dealing with the same issues. We're not wrestling with the same problems. We're not perplexed by the same struggles. And so for people of faith, reflection is a critical spiritual discipline. Because when we as people of faith spend time in reflection, very often God opens our eyes to see those whom God has used in our lives. You know, those folks that were door openers, those individuals that provided guidance and direction along the way, those folks that were our cheerleaders, our supporters, and our encouragers. No? How about this? You know, those folks that because they saw something in us that we didn't see in ourselves, they pushed us, they challenged us, they critiqued us. They would not allow us to give up, make excuses, or settle for subpar. That we need to be intentional, church, about building in, if you're not doing it, the discipline of reflection. Being intentional about looking back and looking at your days and your life, because it is the essential ingredient that God uses to help God's people not only in the present, but also moving forward. But, you know there was a but coming, right? But, we also need to be careful about looking back. Because sometimes we can become so enamored with the past that you find yourself stuck in it or reliving it. I would suggest to you this morning that part of the difficulty that we are facing as a nation and as a society is that there are some who want the country to go back to what they feel is a better time. But my question is, for who? Because yesterday's glory years for some were misery for others. But then there's a deeper spiritual problem with reveling in the past. That it's an indication that we're not seeing God at work in our present. That we may be struggling to hear God calling us to God's current and God's present work. How many people know that, yes, God rested on the sixth day in Genesis, but not forever? That he's still working. He didn't put the gone fishing sign up. He ain't on vacation. That there are some new places and some new things that God is calling the church to today. That we need to be careful. That we don't find ourselves like the Israelites marching around the same mountain for 40 years because the obstacles in front of us seem too greater than the problems we left in Egypt. You go back to Egypt if you want, I ain't following you. That's your choice. But then we begin to romanticize the past. We remember all of the good, and then we begin to reframe it. You ever heard this one? It wasn't that bad. And so instead of stepping out on faith, we become stuck in fear. But we keep telling ourselves, it wasn't that bad. bad. But we forget the lessons that grandma and great-grandma taught us. We forget the lessons of our Sunday school teachers, our Bible teachers, our former pastors who have gone before us. That faith is forged in struggle. That a robust faith, one that doesn't give up easily, one that isn't dissuaded, derailed, and discouraged, is birthed by what we go through and not what we have obtained. This is the testimony of the church. This is the testimony of those who have gone before us. That their knowledge of God and how they came to believe in God was born out of their struggle. Because remember, they never got what they were promised. You know, I thought about this week, right? My father, who grew up watching the KKK burn crosses on people's houses. My grandmother, who immigrated to this country in 1919 from Barbados, never saw the first black African-American president. Never. People who believed God, but they never saw what God promised. And this is how they could implore us to keep the faith. And for some of you, your parents, your grandparents, they lived by faith. And it was faith that propelled them when all hell was breaking out around them. But yet they continued to walk by faith. And I declare today that their voices are still speaking to us. That they're still speaking, reminding us that faith is forged in struggle. It's not what you have obtained, but it's what you go through. The biblical writer says, therefore, we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. And so I believe that the writer asks us, in addition to looking back, don't forget to also look around you. Look around you. Look around and see who is part of your journey. Right? Because when you can't see God by looking back, sometimes you just need to look at the people God has surrounded you by. Right? That God is still speaking today, Flatlands. Through those men and women who have played a vital and a pivotal role in our personal development and formation. That God is still speaking through the voices of those who were our mentors, our guardians, our caretakers, our former teachers and educators, through our former pastors and Sunday school teachers. And if you were RCA, through the deacons and the elders. And all of the other people that we may have forgotten, that God used to shape and to form us into the men and the women that we have become today, that you and I did not get to where we are by ourselves. that many of those who are part of our journey, yes, they've gone on to glory. And though they may not be physically present with us, I suggest to you that their advice, their counsel, their words of instruction remains in us. It remains with us. It's still helping some of us to navigate and to negotiate the difficulties and the hardships that we face today. And so, in this sense, the writer of Hebrews is trying to anchor our current walk of faith with the lived experience of those in the much larger, wider spiritual community. In fact, theologians call it the invisible church. Those who were part of the body, that you and I are connected to them, that their absence doesn't cancel out their contribution. Their departure doesn't break our spiritual connection with them. And so that the writer has tried to establish that you and I today belong to a long and a rich history and lineage in the Christian tradition. But in accepting that truth or that fact, we must also acknowledge an inconvenient truth. The text says, let us run with perseverance the race that has been marked out for us. In other words, that those who have gone before, they finished their race. They finished God's course for them. And so the question that you and I are confronted with today is, what are we doing with what we have been given? Hello, Flatlands. That the saints who have gone before us, God used them to lay a foundation. And the expectation is that when they went to claim their reward, they handed the mantle to us. And so how are we building and expanding on the foundation and the structures that they have laid? Or let me put it another way. In the same way that God used a village to help us to get to where we are, whom are we doing the same for? Real quiet in here. All right. Verses 4 to 11 deal with the issue of God's correction. The idea that God is calling the church, not the world, to make some corrections. Right? And the rationale is very simple, because the church represents Jesus to the world. The world says that every man, woman, and child for him or herself. But what the writer says here is not so, says the Lord. Because, see, that philosophy and that approach is why our world, city, nation is in the state and the condition we're in today. And so God is calling us today to take up the mantle of those who have gone before us, to follow in their footsteps, to do for others today what has been done for us. Listen, you and I may not be able to change the conditions that exist in our world, but you know what we can do, Flatlands? We can change the course and the direction of a young person's life. that we can change the course and the direction of those who are coming behind us. That God is not calling the church to change the world. God is calling the church to introduce those in our lives to Jesus, to help them come to know him, and to create space for them to grow in a relationship with him. And through that relationship, God will enable them to experience God's change in their life. You know, the same things folks did for us. And so in the final analysis, so I can stop punishing you all with this message, that the walk of faith, being a part of the body of Christ, isn't a solo endeavor, because God uses people to help people. The writer of Hebrews declares that if you're going to follow Jesus, you need a village view and not a tribal mentality. See, tribal mentality says it's us against them. But a village view understands that individual success is tied to corporate connection. That I do better when I'm a part of. That I do better when I'm connected to a faithful community. That I do better when I'm surrounded and connected to others who are following Jesus. That I do better when I'm exposed to the collective wisdom and experience of those who have seen what I haven't seen, who have been where I'm trying to go, who are familiar with the pitfalls, the landmines, the potholes along the way. That when you're part of a village, you get it. Because people make sure you understand that everything we have today is directly tied to those who have gone before us. Their pain, their struggle has paved the way for us today. And God is calling us to remember that our pain and our struggle will also pave the way for people who are coming behind us. And so the invitation this morning is, if you're not connected, God is inviting you today to get connected, because everyone needs community. And as a Jesus-loving community, we want you. Because it takes a village. It takes a village.